influence policies, choices. You know why we get to do that? Because we live in wonderful countries that are democratic countries that allow us to do this. So it's on the one hand an enormous sense of responsibility, but it is the best thing you could ever do. And I'll end it with this. I didn't fully appreciate it until in those early days when I started knocking on doors. And I represent a riding in Canada called Markham Thornhill. It is a very diverse riding. I have wonderful constituents that come. There were, over 70% of my riding is not, are visible minorities. Wonderful, Asian community, Jewish community, Muslim, multi-faith and multicultural. I knocked on the door, and my by-election was also in February, and there was a lot of snow, and you can relate to that here in Detroit. It was very cold, and this wonderful man came to the door and said, "Oh, ma'am, hang on 1 second." I'm like, okay, because of course I am knocking on the door and I am asking for his support. And so I'm waiting, and it's really cold, and he brings to the door his daughter and his wife. And you know what he said? He said, "Look, she's running to be our voice, and we want to support you." And he said to his daughter, "You can do what she does too." Wow. That's the reason for being involved. And so, like I said, on the one hand, I feel a sense of responsibility, and I do believe you have to see her and him when it comes to visible minorities, minority groups. But you have to see it to believe it is possible. And I believe with every fiber of my being, it is absolutely possible. And Catherine and I, getting the privilege to do the work to serve the people of America and the people of Canada is an extreme honor. But I can say and I would say this, we certainly can't do it alone. We get to keep doing the work. We get the license to do work in the democracy when people are there with us. And you're amazing people.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll just keep sharing it. Thank you so much for your heartfelt comments. I don't know if you guys saw the New York Times article on Connie Chung and the generation of Connies. And it was basically, of course, the legendary newscaster, Connie Chung. There was a generation of young girls who were named Connie. Many of them only discovered one another in college. And that's when many of them started, this is pre-Facebook, keeping in touch with one another and realized how many Connies there are. So when you talk about representation, when you talk about what is possible, just by being yourselves, but especially in the roles that you're in, it just makes little boys and girls think, hey, I could do that too. That's a phenomenal thing. The murder of Vincent Chin is something that we discussed a little bit earlier, and its effects still reverberate today. It in part stemmed from preconceived notions of disloyalty, something that we're seeing today in both the US and Canada as relations with China have changed. How can the United States and Canada compete with China in a way that does not fuel anti-Asian sentiment back home?
I have the mic, let me start. Priya, let me just push back a little bit on the way you framed that question. I don't know if you look into the actual facts, and Jim will know the facts like the back of his hand. I don't know that it was about preconceived notions of disloyalty. The way that I've always thought about what happened to Vincent Chin and his murder was it happened it was 41 years ago, so it would have been 1982, right? We have just had the anniversary. And he was out at his own bachelor party. And this was at a time of heightened U.S.-Japan economic tensions. Now remember, Japan has always been an ally, at least in this period of time. So it wasn't a foreign policy issue, it was an economic tensions issue. And here, in this town, Motor City, Motown, the competition in the auto sector, I think, was felt particularly strongly. And so Vincent was spotted at the bar, and he was beaten to death with a baseball bat. For, yes, appearing Asian and being associated with this economic pressure. The reason why I wanted to go through the specifics here is, in my mind, it tells a story about how economic insecurity is deeply destabilizing and dangerous to our democracy. And this actually is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about now, at this time, at this moment. And you're right in making the connection to the sense of very intense competition with China economically in the world. And I think that what this means is that as we contend with the competition and the pressures, we have to confront the challenge. Because if we don't, there's actually no hope that things will get better or that we will be able to redress it. But in confronting the challenge, we also have to be really, really studied and disciplined to be fact-based and evidence-based about defining what the problem is and what the problem is not. And so I've said that our problems are with the Chinese government and the impacts of their economic policies on the rest of us. That is something we have got to take head on. But the problem is not about Chineseness or Asianness. It is not about the Chinese people or Asian culture or heritage. And the reason why we have to bring that kind of discipline is because, one, we have legitimate challenges that are significant. And second, we have to be able to address those challenges. If we are sloppy or lazy in the way that we approach addressing those challenges, what we stand to do is an incredible amount of damage to our fellow citizens and to our democracy. And so I think that especially working in trade, where we are at the center of a lot of the economic pressures and challenges, this is part of the reason for our intense focus on reorienting the way that we do trade to make sure that we are putting the interests of America's workers at the center, all of America's workers. Because I think that every time we lose the focus on our trade and economic policies being here to build our economy from the bottom up and the middle out, when we lose that focus, we stand to lose the significant parts of the integrity of this American and democratic experiment.
So I agree with that. In Canada, I've been saying to people that words do matter. And when you have narrative that, that causes aspersions to any community, let alone visible, minority community, then people get hurt. We saw that during the pandemic, the rise of the pandemic and it being associated not with the disease itself, but with people who may have, who may look Chinese, which could be Asians, caused harm on people. So words really do matter. When you call a virus a China virus and then it flows over into people, then those people get hurt. And we saw in Vancouver, so a city in Canada, saw an increase in anti-Asian racism by 100%. I just looked at the numbers just recently for the work I was doing yesterday, and even in the last year, it's about 45% over last year, the rise of anti-Asian racism. So it's still there, and 2/3 of the victims are women. So, and in Canada, diversity is a fact. We are a multicultural country where a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, but you celebrate the heritage from where your heritage. So whether you're Indian or Japanese or Chinese or Pakistani or, European, it doesn't matter. We celebrate each other's heritages in this multicultural fabric that is Canada. And I think for people like me, but it isn't just people like me who have a public podium to speak about, you have to be able to stand up against it and you have to call out hate. But then what you do, and what I hope we have been able to do as a government, is to do that at all the leadership levels. So I call it out, the Prime Minister calls it out, so that we won't stand for hate. But what we also do is we work with allies across the country in business, unions, not-for-profit groups, civil society groups, to stand together, because hate is hate. And what I saw in terms of the most awful parts of anti-Asian racism, I also saw the very best of humanity at the same time, which was the coming together of people as allies, businesses. I remember convening, and that group today exists, and they are still doing this work, pulling people together in Canada to work together, no different than the organizations that are here today, to really both, on the one hand, stand up against hate, but to pull communities together so that you can do this kind of multi-faith and multicultural collaboration. So it's businesses who at the beginning of the pandemic, was quite worried that they may not have employees who may look like us in the front parts of their businesses, and they would be relegated to the back offices, right? It was, and convening business leaders in Canada so that they understood, so that it became conscious for them. And when it became conscious, we became collaborators together. The Government of Canada also has invested $11 million, for example, towards anti-Asian racism out of 2 budgets ago, to support groups in Canada that would then develop capacity and capability at the community level to work across communities in order to tackle the various issues around hate, but also inclusiveness. It's convening those allies. I remember having a roundtable conversation with the Montreal Chinatown group, and said that the seniors were worried about getting out of the street, and that citizens were worried about getting out and just sort of doing their day-to-day. And we were able to convene the chiefs of police in sort of law enforcement of jurisdiction, to be able to bring them in so that we can all actually be building together the solution together. There is a lot of work that still needs to be done. Yesterday in Vancouver, I announced the federal government's commitment or funding towards Canada's first ever Chinese-Canadian History Museum. And the reason it's important is because we talked about the journey across the Pacific to both the US and Canada by immigrants in the Pacific. And the journey in the 1800s that was in response to the gold rush here in the US, similar one in Canada, but the extreme discrimination that they faced, the laws and the policies that were put together by both of our respective governments that led to exclusion of Chinese, Canadians, and Americans at the time. It led to the, and we come from this dark history where both countries also interned Japanese, Canadians, and Americans at a time. But what actually became the solution? It was people. People came together, allies finding other allies. At that time, it was not accepting, Chinese Canadians not accepting these exclusionary laws that were discriminating of them. And they went to sympathetic politicians, to labor unions, to other people in the communities, and as a way of being able to fight. It took until 1947 to repeal that law. But that law did get repealed. And what's the moral of the story? The one where Catherine and I started out with, and that Jim also made the appeal to. Every single one of you and every single one of your friends and neighbors who may feel in the same way have a voice. Your voice and your action counts and matters, and it is through that participation. It is actually through that participation that can change policies, that can change laws, and that can create the country and the community and the neighborhood that you want, that we want together.
Thank you.
Do you remember those Canadian Heritage Moment ads growing up?
Absolutely, it's the stamp. It's and it was wonderful because it appeared everywhere, and they would teach you those moments, and it was wonderful. Now I'm just trying to recount what was the latest one that I saw.
Well, I just remember the one in what you were talking about the railroad and how the railroad was built in Canada. That was my first time understanding the toll that had been taken and paid for by Chinese Canadians in making that railroad. So history matters. Knowing about your heritage, knowing about where your family has come from, those things do make a difference. Real quick, when it comes to identity, as a Canadian, we always used to say growing up, Canadian meant white people, and then everybody else was like, where are you from? It took me a very long time to adopt an understanding of myself as an Indian woman. It was always Canadian first and foremost, and of course that's where I'm from. But even identity, even how I perceive myself, it has been quite a journey to get to that point. But leaders like yourselves make it so much easier to accept and embrace who
Maybe
you are.
on that point about the Heritage Moments. The Heritage Moments are created by Heritage Canada, just like the work that Catherine co-chairs as well. When you have administrations and governments who intentionally both invest and put policies and leaders to do the work that Catherine and I get the opportunity to do, that is where governments matter and can matter. So the Heritage Moments is great, but it actually is, it is an intentional, purposeful piece of work that the Government of Canada undertakes.
And you both are living history right now, right?
I just want to say, I feel very left out on this next conversation.
Okay, they were really nice ads. They were like 2 minutes long and they told us about history.
I gathered, could we talk about Degrassi Junior High?
Yes.
That's the one piece of
See, I knew we were gonna
Canadian
get
middle
along.
school culture that I can't participate in.
But you're talking the OG Degrassi, right? Not the one with Drake.
That's correct.
Yeah, the OG one. Okay. All right, well, both of you are also here for the Asia Pacific Economic Corporation meeting, which the United States is hosting this year. How are you both ensuring that the benefits of trade are available to everyone, particularly underrepresented communities here in the US and in Canada?
Yes, this is a great question. So the theme for our host year and the ministerial that I get the chance to host here in Detroit is, let me make sure, a resilient and sustainable economy for all. And that theme of resilience, sustainability, and inclusiveness keeps coming up, and the circuit of meetings and ministerials that Mary and I participate in talking to people who have the jobs that we have from around the world, top of mind for everyone who is responsible for economic policy in their governments and for this outward-facing international piece of economic policy is how do we apply the lessons from these past couple of years? How can we work together to build a more resilient economy for ourselves, a more resilient global economy, one that is more sustainable, where we have more confidence in the long runway ahead of us, that we are building an economy that is going to be growing and prosperous and bright for our kids and their kids, and then also this inclusivity, making sure that the benefits of our economic policies are much more broadly shared. So in this respect, what I really want to highlight is in early days, in the first year of my becoming trade representative, I asked a sister agency of ours, an independent agency, largely run by economists and some lawyers, the International Trade Commission, to conduct an investigation and write a report for us, looking at what have been the distributional effects of our trade policies going back for many years. Because we have long suspected that the distributional impacts have been really uneven, but we've actually never asked the question as a government in an organized way. And what the ITC produced back for us last year in their report was, number one, we're not collecting the kind of data We're not asking the questions in a systematic way that would give us a very granular understanding. Nevertheless, based on the data that we do have, based on studies that have been conducted, what the ITC told us is the distributional impacts have been very uneven. Who has not benefited as much from trade? Who actually might have been harmed by our trade policies? There are communities of color, there are women of color, and then I also really want to highlight, because this part doesn't get picked up very often, also white, non-college educated men. And I think that in terms of our ethos of inclusivity, of bringing a new approach to trade, to ensure that those impacts and those benefits are more broadly shared, those are the allies, those are the ones, the small companies also, small businesses part of your jurisdiction, to ensure that we are expanding access to opportunity. That's what governments should be doing. And that is the core of the building the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. If you hear President Biden talk about this, and he does it quite a lot, the vision is the opposite of top down. So what you do is you focus on creating opportunities for those at the bottom to give them a pathway to moving into the middle. And then you try to expand the middle class as broadly as you can, because a strong middle class makes for a strong country. And that's the vision. So it is going to require us to rethink trade significantly. And we need partners to do that, because you can't trade with yourself. So consistently through our work, through forums like the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, I am out here looking for allies, building relationships so that we can innovate in the area of trade and start looking for ways to promote economic policies that create resilient sustainability and that all-important inclusivity.
Thank you.
Well, I'll dive into one specific piece that is about Canada and the United States. When we renegotiated our new trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, there was a really terrific chapter that was put in. And it was for greater collaborative work between our countries on small and medium-sized businesses. Now, in Canada, I do have both sides of the job. I'm the Minister of Trade, but I'm also the Minister responsible for small businesses and economic development. Prime Minister Trudeau put this portfolio together in this way because in Canada, 99% of our businesses are small and medium-sized businesses. And we're 38 million people. We're like the size of California in population, but we are the 10th largest economy in the world. Our largest trading partner is with the United States. But again, it's about making sure that trade is inclusive and that the benefits of trade yield to all people in our society, so that these small businesses, women-owned businesses, which by nature are small, Black-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, LGBTQ2-owned businesses, that they are getting the benefit of growth and growth through trade. So if I think about the Free Trade Commission that Catherine and I in Mexico, we host this every single year to take a look at how our trade relationship is working. One of the most exciting things we did last year was we actually had a women-led trade mission complement the work that we were doing as government. So we had this wonderful delegation of women in trade from all three countries come to the Free Trade Commission to work, actually to do business in parallel to our work as government. That is deliberate architecture from our standpoint. And I'll end it with this. In Canada, I also lead the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy. It is almost $7 billion program now. It has three parts. One, helping women entrepreneurs get access to capital. Second, creating an ecosystem of support that includes business training, mentorship, access to business networks. And the third part that is about measuring and data. In Canada, we can add $150 billion to our economy by one thing, adding women to the economy. And globally, if we do that, it's $12 trillion. And But economic policy alone won't do it. $10 a day early learning and childcare is what we've implemented in Canada, and parental leave. So when you can create, some would say it's social policy, it's economic policy. It's smart, progressive policies that bet on people, it bets on the middle class, and it intentionally creates policies and architecture that helps those that are working, those that are in the middle class, or those working hard to join the middle class, become the middle class, and create growth and prosperity in our country. And it is building these relationships and more on on this sort of premise of these values that we just talked about.
Thank you so much for being here with us today. Can we give a round, warm applause for Ambassador Tai and Minister Ng talking about trade, talking about this important relationship between the U.S. and Canada. Thank you so much. Representation matters, and we are all lucky to have you in this important role. Thank you so much. Can we give them another round of applause, please?
Thank you so much. And just for the interest of time, if we can just have a quick picture with the MAPEC commissioners and our guest, Ambassador Tai and Honorable Minister Mary Yang, quickly on stage.
Notice we have matching shoes. We didn't even plan that. All right, everybody, come on in, don't be shy.
All right, do we need any direction? We need to.
We'll start in the middle. Okay.
Just stare center. You're good. All right.
Okay, then look here, those squares.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. You're doing such a great job. Nice to meet you so much. Oh my goodness. Yeah, for sure.
Professor,
Yes.
first of all, how do you want me to address you?
You can call me Roland.
Roland? Okay, yes. Can you send me the link of US Today article?
I don't know what the link is.
Oh.
I forgot to introduce our wonderful Canadian